Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes on this rainy Thursday morning. Needed this rain, and we're thankful for it. And we're going to talk about co-ops today as it relates to Ward 7 and Ward 8. Miss Janis Hazel is going to be on the phone as soon as she gets... Janis, are you on?
Yes, how are you?
Hey, there you are. Thank you. I'm great. How are you doing?
Good, good.
Fantastic. Glad you're taking out time of your busy schedule to talk with us this morning.
Oh, yes, no problem.
So I want to get right into it to talk about Mr. Vincent Gray's Ward 7 action plan.
Okay.
So I understand that you are his communications director? Or
yes.
Yeah, okay. So you're in charge of getting out the word, so that's what we want to do today.
Yes.
So I understand he wants the city to build a hospital and a couple of grocery stores and some retail in Ward 7 and 8.
Yes, well, let me go back to the Ward 7 action plan, which was a product of a summit, the Ward 7 Action Summit that Councilmember Gray, before he was sworn into office back in December, he coordinated and conducted a summit where there was over 400 people in attendance from Ward 7, residents and other stakeholders, business owners in the ward, individuals who work in the ward, who may or may not live in the ward, but stakeholders, principally residents, that came together. It was a facilitated process similar to when he was mayor of the district, in which he had a One City Action Summit. And he also held, back in 2013, a Ward 7 Economic Development Summit. So this summit brought together individuals to deal with issues of importance to the community, Ward 7 in particular, and it laid the groundwork for what his legislative agenda is now. From that framework, he said that he is laser focused on improving the quality of life for Ward 7 and residents of the East End of the District of Columbia, which you'll notice he says East End now throughout his communications because he's rebranding our side of the Anacostia River, Ward 7 and 8, that have for many years been known as the east of the river, east of the Anacostia, which on some levels has a negative moniker, unlike the west end of the city. So when you hear me say East End, that's what he's discussing. And from that summit that was facilitated with tabulation machines on each table, questionnaires were given out, and the residents went through topic by topic, and they came up with 4 major goals of that plan, which are goal number 1, to improve the educational outcomes of Ward 7 residents. Number 2, to restore public safety to Ward 7 neighborhoods. Goal 3, to bring economic development, amenities, and employment opportunities to Ward 7 residents. And number 4, to improve the quality of life for all Ward 7 residents, and by extension, the East End, which goes to Ward 8, because we find many similarities within the communities that have, on many levels, been disenfranchised and don't have a lot of the amenities that we see on the West End of the city. So that's what formed the Ward 7 Action Plan, which we were able to publish in March of this year. The summit was in December. These were all funds, nearly $100,000 that he raised on his own because he was not in government at that time, to be able to utilize budget of the city. So he raised these funds from private donors in order to put on the summit and then to publish the Ward 7 Action Plan, which is the framework for all the legislation, 23 pieces of legislation that he has introduced since January 2nd when he was sworn in. So under those 4 goals, you'll see.
Jan, can I have the plan in front of me, the Ward 7 Action Plan, and
great.
with Mr. Gray's picture on front, and I see the 4 goals right in the table of contents. And it's a wonderful piece, and one of the things I was excited about it is he got people together. I think he said that he expected 150 people, and he got 400. So he put the call out, and people came, and that's a cooperative value is getting everybody. And the first principle of cooperative is everybody's included. Doesn't make any difference about their political affiliations or their race or age or sex or economics. That everybody come to the table and tell us what you want. So that's the first thing, is that I was excited when I heard what he did. I wish I had known, so I could have been in that room also and participating. So maybe the next time he does this, I'll know about it. So I'm liking what he put together because it's people focused, people driven. It's what the residents say that they want.
Yes.
All right. So now you can keep going with these 4. Out of these 4 goals, he had 23 pieces of legislation.
23 pieces of legislation that have been introduced so far, and we have more that we intend to introduce before the end of this legislative session, which we're going into recess July 15th through, I believe, September 14th or 15th, and then the session will recess again in December, come back. The session will end in December of next year. So the cycle, for those who are not as intimately familiar with the legislative cycle, you want to introduce your legislation, go through markups, which is literally when council members mark up legislation and go through picking over what they want in it or what they don't, from hearing from constituents, from residents and stakeholders in the district. So we just finished the budget cycle, which the budget was introduced by the mayor April 4th, I believe, and between April 6th and last week, there were hearings where the public came in and talked about what they want, what they don't want, what they didn't see in the budget, what they need in the budget, and what Councilmember Gray's legislation spoke to, particularly these pieces of legislation that are to help bring amenities to the east end of the city, such as the East End Grocery and Retail Incentive Program Tax Abatement Act of 2017. I know that's a mouthful, but effectively that is incentivizing businesses to locate on the east end of the city while the city provides them with tax incentives and abatements. Also, East End Surplus Allocation Equitable Investment Act, another mouthful, but those are incentives to bring investment, retailers, grocery, as well as dining experiences to the east end of the city. He also introduced, I think, the big cornerstone piece of legislation is the East End Healthcare Desert, Retail Desert, and Food Desert Elimination Act of 2017. In that, it enables the District of Columbia to effectively build out a facility, to construct a location, and then have a retailer, be it a healthcare provider, retail provider, or grocery store provider, to come in, operate their business in that building. Because a lot of what we're hearing is, oh, the costs are so expensive to come in and build out in our community, which we know that to be a bit of a fallacy, because people on the East End buy groceries, buy goods and services, consume health care just like anyone else. However, that is a stigma that we are trying to overcome. So the council member introduced this one big piece of legislation to enable the city to actually build out on parcels that the city owns. So that takes away that one issue of a retailer or hospital provider or grocer to come in. They just have to operate. He has definitely been an ardent advocate for getting a healthcare system and hospital on the East End because United Medical Center, the facility itself, is failing. It's over 50 years old, and that's a part of that piece of legislation. So I think the piece that you were most interested in is the East End Healthcare Desert, Retail Desert, and Food Desert Elimination Act, which you came out to testify on behalf of back May 19th, where we had well over 80 people sign up to come and testify. And that day went on until, oh my goodness, I think around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening.
That was exciting for me. It started at 11 and it was sort of billed that it would be over at 1, 2 hours, and then you're going to start another one hearing. And there was so many people that showed up, which is another sort of indication of how interested people are on the Ward 7 and 8. So I sat there till 4 when I testified. And what was interesting was listening to everybody else and really talking about a health system, the whole system of increasing one's health, not just a hospital, but having the quality foods, the organic, good foods and exercise and education and everything that's needed in clinics and hospitals so that people can have good health. And because there's some stats, and I don't know them all, you may know better than I, the number of children that die in the district, the birth rate was one of the highest in the nation. I used to know the stat, but we have some bad health in the district.
Well, we do indeed, and in fact, one of the reasons that he introduced, well, as you may and your listeners may recall, when the council member was mayor, he put in the budget funds to build out the East End Medical Center, which would be fully integrated with an ambulatory healthcare facility and an urgent care healthcare facility, because on the East End, we do not have, as odd as it may seem, an actual urgent care provider once you pretty much leave North Capitol. And there might be one in the Eastern Market area, someone told me. However,
Janis, can you hold there for a minute? We'll come back and talk more about the health care and what he is intending to do. We have to take our first break. This is very exciting. I really thank you for coming on and sharing this information with me and our guests and everything that Mr. Gray is doing for Ward 7 and Ward 8. But we'll be right back. Please do not touch that dial. Information is power, and that's the reason that National Co-op Bank is sponsoring this program, to give you information about cooperatives, information about the community, so that you can take this information and put it into action. That's where you get the power. If you don't do something with the information, there is no power in it. It's like having gas in a car, but until you ignite it, there's nothing. There's no power. There's no go. So we're hoping you'll take the information that we provide on this show and either start your own co-op, get with a group of people to start one, or look for co-ops to do business with. And today we have Miss Janis Hazel, who's talking about the kinds of things that Vincent Gray and his office is doing to give people power. Particularly, we were just talking about health care. And Janet, you were telling us about health care. Could you continue that conversation?
Well, yes, something that Councilmember Gray speaks to quite frequently is the health conditions that exist, the large disparity between the East End and the Western wards. And we could rattle off a bunch of statistics to prove the point, but I think one speaks louder than the rest. If you live in Ward 2, your life expectancy is about 86 years. If you live in Ward 8, that number is reduced by 16 years and plummets to age 70. So in terms of an integrated healthcare system that the council member is seeking to have built in a new healthcare facility, a hospital, the East End Hospital, it really proves and goes to the core of us not having a system in which geography determines your lifespan. It's unjust, and we need to do better.
I want to go back over that. I want to make sure everybody got that, and I want to make sure I got it. You said if you're in Ward 2, which is west, is 86 years, your life expectancy. But
yes.
In Ward 7, it's 70 years?
Well, Ward 8, and that's based on a report that he's pulled information from. If you live in Ward 8, that number is reduced by 16 years and plummets to age 70. We can say that that's pretty much mirrored in Ward 7.
What did you do it for men? Because I heard some staggering numbers for Cleveland. If you lived in the suburbs of Cleveland, it was like 86 years, a white male. And if you were a black man living in the inner city of Cleveland, it dropped way down. It was in the 60s. The drop was huge, 20, 30-year drop. So I was
at the moment, I'm not able to put my fingers on what report this came from, so I don't know if the indicators were principally male subjects or female or both. However, the statistic that we have utilized has an indicator of the lifespan of one side of our city. So it may have come from the D.C. Department of Health, or it may have come from the Census Bureau. However, right now I can't tell you exactly what report it was pulled from.
So you get both how long one lives, and Janis, I'm turning 70 here in October, so I'm really concerned about life expectancy, but not only life expectancy, but quality of life. It is how well do you live? Are you going into the dialysis machines are heavy in black neighborhoods throughout the U.S., so you have to go into dialysis machine on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday or something. And my brother lived this, so he told me about this life being a diabetic, and I am also. And he died at 64 years old in Detroit. But his life for 10, 12 years was awful, because Monday, Wednesday, and Friday he's having his blood transfused, and then he's trying to get some energy on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And the only day he was sort of like having any energy or any life was on Sunday. And then he starts that whole system all over again.
Well, that's one of the primary objectives of Councilmember Gray as the chairman of the Committee on Health. He serves as chairperson of the Committee on Health. And being a native Washingtonian, he is focused on ensuring that the East End has an integrated healthcare system that is the envy of other cities. It's interesting you would cite your brother having had an illness and succumbed in Detroit. As you may know, I'm from Detroit originally, and I can say that my father had a similar incident. He passed away a month short of his 66th birthday. And he, too, had renal failure, diabetes, adult onset diabetes. He had hypertension that was developed over lifestyle as well as diet. And in Detroit, we see health deserts. We definitely see food deserts. And, I am not an expert in terms of co-ops. Never owned a co-op in terms of housing or condo. I've always had a house, but I understand the concept of co-ops. I've only shopped in a co-op once, and that was with a friend over in the Tacoma Park area. But I understand the concept. And we see these types of health disparities throughout the United States in traditionally African-American communities. I certainly am aware of it coming out of Detroit and having lived in Washington for many decades. And those are things that the council member is focused on. There's really no acceptable reason why, in what is widely regarded as the healthcare capital of the world here in D.C., where we're seeing health outcomes of a third world country. You mentioned infants. Morbidity rate, we had a high incidence of infant mortality, which is a child dying in their first year of life. And largely, that number has reduced greatly. However, when we were seeing that, it's because many African-American mothers don't receive the prenatal health care that they should during their pregnancy. And so the health outcome when the child is born is significantly reduced. And without the accessibility of health care, a number of parents don't get in when they should. So it is apparent that we need a new state-of-the-art hospital, to serve our East End residents who are impacted by the health desert and the food desert. They go hand in hand. To be healthy, you need to have access to healthy, nutritious food options. As you know, I serve as an advisory neighborhood commissioner in Ward 7 as well.
Well, you're my ANC commissioner. Yes, I know.
I am your
You do a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the fights that I have had for the retailers and restaurateurs coming into our area of the East End is I took a stand. I would not support, and I would fight licensing and permitting of any business that had a deep fryer as its major food preparation equipment. And that was to stop the tide of fast food coming into our area. For those who don't know, Denny's is right in my single-member district. Denny's provides a wide range of menu options, but there's only 3 restaurants in Ward 7, 2 Thai restaurants where you can sit down, and Denny's, and we need more. And so the Shrimp Boat, which is just 2 blocks from my house, will be opening soon. And the concept went from a Checkers fast food, which I vehemently opposed with the new buyer last year who purchased it. I said, if it's a Checkers, I'll be boycotting it myself every day. And we came to a consensus that he would provide a more nutritious food offering if it was to be a food retailer. And it will open as more of a Union Market or Eastern Market type of food court with a coffee shop, with Wi-Fi. It will have a frozen yogurt and ice cream vendor. It will have a donut, fresh-made donuts, where you can put your own toppings on and see the donuts being made. And he's trying to settle with the final vendor. He started out with something like a Panda Express or Teriyaki Madness, and I think that has morphed into more of a nutritious Southern-style soul food, if you will, similar to a Carolina Kitchen type of example. It won't be as large. However, that's what he's trying to do. And that's what our community has to advocate for. When a business is coming in, you need to let the community, the proprietor know what we want and what we don't want, what is acceptable and what is not. And for the health disparities, the obesity, the high rate of hypertension, the diabetes, the childhood diabetes, the adult diabetes, we don't need food options that are not nutritious. And then grocery options, we have a real challenge with groceries on the East End. So, that's somewhere that perhaps your co-ops could prevail, in addition to brick and mortar retailers that we see on other sides of the city.
Let me just give you a quick, you and the audience, a quick definition of co-ops. It's any business that is owned and controlled. Well, the different types of co-ops depends on who owns and controls it. If it's owned and controlled by the employees, then it's called a worker cooperative. And so any business that you can think of could be a worker cooperative. If it's owned and controlled by the consumers, then it's called a consumer cooperative, and that's like credit unions. The credit unions are owned by the people who deposit their money in there. Housing co-ops are owned by the people that live in the buildings in the cooperative. So that's the different types. And there is a clinic, Janis, in Madison, Wisconsin, a health clinic that's owned and controlled by the people that go there. It's a consumer co-op, so it's a patient-centric clinic. And so all the policies and procedures are based on what the patients want out of that business. So those are the 2 major types. And then there's another one. There are a lot of farmers, and USDA knows a lot about co-ops because farmers have been using co-ops since the 20s and 30s, and maybe before that, but got very, very big in the 20s and 30s. So if they come together to buy what they need, then it's a purchasing co-op. They can buy the feed or gasoline or whatever. And artists are doing this now, and equipment. And they also form marketing co-ops to market the products, and they get experts in both of those to either buy what they need or to market their goods to many. And Cabot Creamery is an example. So there's a number of different ones. So we're going to take our second break, Janis. We'll be right back to talk more about what Mr. Vincent Gray and you guys are doing and the cooperative world. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. The program is Everything Cooperative. It's sponsored by the National Cooperative Bank, whose mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. So, Janis, you'll find National Co-op Bank in Detroit and here in D.C. and everywhere, in particular in rural America and low-income communities, which is always interesting to me how well they do this job. They were created in the early 80s by Congress to support cooperatives, and they do a very, very good job. Because most bankers, as you know, they're only interested in loaning to people that already have assets, and a lot of times that's not in our communities. So we, as African Americans, more often than not, and anybody else that is economically challenged, don't get banking services. So NCB was there, and they work a lot with credit unions, and credit unions will create products for people that don't necessarily have a lot of assets. What co-ops do, Janis, is they come into an area that's like a food desert, where there's a community need and where people come together. And there is a group in the district, and they're meeting tomorrow, that's wanting to create a food co-op and maybe several other ones to solve the community need. And then the co-op, the food co-op, is owned by the consumers, by the people that come in. And I'm wanting to work with them, but hopefully I will get somebody to tell me where they're meeting today so I can put that on the air so if people want to come in and meet with them. So how does this legislation look? Did we get the money in the budget for the things that Mr. Gray wants to put in for Ward 7 and 8 that's needed?
Well, it is estimated that the build out of an East End hospital would be roughly $336 million. So throughout the budget cycle, we were able to get $300 million into the budget, and that those funds were pulled from other committees. Councilmember Mary Che was so gracious as to provide $100 million, scrubbing that from various non-obligated positions within the committees that she is the chair of, which is Energy and Environment and Transportation. Also, other members of the council added funds from their committees, monies that were unobligated, and they could move around largely vacant positions that had not been filled, and push that over because these other wards, Mary Che over in Ward 3 recognizes that there are a number of hospitals accessible to residents that happen to live within her council boundaries, and it's really not fair. That was her view, that members of the community that live on the East End don't have the same options as those in the West End. So there was a great collaborative effort between members of the council to help fund the build-out of the hospital, which formerly, when Councilmember Gray was mayor, he had fully funded it in his budget, but those funds were unfortunately removed during the time in which he was not on the mayor or council. So we got up to $300 million. So effectively, there's about $36 million that we're short that we do believe will be able to get restored through the budget cycle next year. So right now, $300 million will get us through design phase, through quite a bit to get to the point of building the integrated hospital system, which the council member selected the St. Elizabeth site for its location, accessibility to Metro Rail, Metro Bus, and in that the current United Medical Center is operating in that site. You can't tear down while you're still trying to operate a facility. So this other site on that very large and lush campus will provide the acreage for the East End Medical Center. So we believe we're on track at the conclusion of this budget cycle to move forward with getting an East End facility.
That would be fantastic. My mother's originally from D.C., and in her later life, she came back here with me and my sister, and she was at that center. My sister was living in Ward 8, and that's where my mother was standing for. And so that hospital, it looked old. It smelled old. Okay.
Over 50 years old.
Okay.
Yes. And it's antiquated in terms of, I don't know the exact lifespan of a building. However, what the district is doing in keeping it operational is putting a lot of money into its stopgap, as opposed to having a facility that is fully operational, which is a newer facility. That one was built, I believe it had around 400 hospital beds, which there are no hospital facilities that provide that type of in-hospital care anymore, just because technology has allowed for that. A lot of procedures have reduced recovery time, and people are able to go home. So this would be more of a 200-bed facility and an urgent care facility. So that's what he's pushing for to get there, along with also addressing the physician shortage that we have on the East End. Back in April, the council member introduced two pieces of legislation to help address the physician shortage. One is the Healthcare Revolving Fund Act of 2017, and the second one is the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact Approval Act. Now, I know that's a mouthful again for those of us who speak legislative ease, but just think in terms of the types of physicians that we don't have, specialists that we don't have on the east end of the city. So a lot of our residents, you mentioned a lot of our residents are taking dialysis. Many of those facilities are not in Ward 7 and 8. So they've got to travel on top of the amount of time that they have to be hooked up to the machines and sit there. Those who don't have a vehicle, they've got to wait for perhaps Metro Access or someone to pick them up. There's a lot that goes into not having access to medical facilities and physicians closer to where you live. And while me coming from Detroit, which is 140 square miles, and D.C. is much, much smaller. I think we are, I don't know, maybe 36 square miles. It's a very different dynamic. But in Detroit, you have everything's connected by highways and vehicles. D.C., it's a different layout, and we need to make sure that our physicians, our specialists, and our hospital care facilities are closer to the people who really need it more. We have so many disparities on the east end of town, and we don't have the physicians to accommodate them.
It was interesting sitting in that hearing and listening to how people have to travel for health care and for food.
Yeah.
That was amazing to me that somebody said, one of the people that live in Ward 7, or these Ward 7 or Ward 8, that they have to have a freezer if you go into most apartments. Now, I'm a property manager, as you know, and I've been in apartments that have freezers, but I never knew the reason. I just, thought that they just wanted extra meat or something. Yeah, a deep freezer in an apartment, and it was because they have to pay money. They have to get taxis or somebody, these guys at the stores, to bring them back home. And so because it takes so much to go, they buy a lot of food and freeze it.
Right.
And I just found that very interesting. And if the electricity goes out, which it does sometimes in the district, then they lose all of that food, which is another big issue. So the Department
of Health classified the entirety of Ward 7 and portions of Ward 8 as health professional shortage areas. So on top of us being classified by the United States Department of Agriculture, our own health department has classified us as health and food desert on the East End.
So one of the reasons that I testified was that co-ops would be the people in the neighborhood coming together and creating the food co-ops, and perhaps also the food co-ops are about half the square footage of a large grocery stores, but food co-ops end up, the people in the community own the business. And there's a lot of benefits for that because they say what's on the shelf. And food co-ops, as an example, they really started this crave on organic foods. And food co-ops, 82% of the fruits and vegetables in a food co-op is organic, where in a conventional grocery store, only 12% are organic. So you get a huge difference because the people that own and run it want to have quality foods, and then they work sourced locally. They work with farmers that are local to get these things in hand. So it's a great way. It's really a wonderful model, which I did not understand when I all the way through school. I never heard about a food co-op. I only heard about them when I started managing housing co-ops, and then learning a lot and the benefits to the employees. In a regular grocery store, they make less money and have less health care than in a food co-op. In a food co-op, the members make about $1 more per hour than a conventional. I'm reading from a study that was done that they make about $1 more per hour in a food co-op than they do in a local grocery store. And a lot more people in a food co-op are available for health benefits, where the regular grocery store, not as many people. So it gets to be really wonderful examples. And I'd like to see if we can't get more information to you and the council member and the other council members about co-ops. There is another group that's called Co-op Stakeholders, and that's coming out of the economic department of the district government. They've had 6 meetings so far, and talking about different co-ops, and I'm wanting to get the lady that's in charge of it on the show, too, to see what they're doing and how they're doing it, and maybe start going to their meetings, too. I have not been to any of them, but a couple people that have gone religiously come back and tell me there's a lot of good things that potentially can happen in the district, and this process is being caused by the city government, which I'm quite excited about. Great.
Good. Well, there are a number of things legislatively happening that Councilmember Gray is putting forth to address the quality of life for members of the community that live on the east end of the city. As I mentioned, these other 2 pieces of legislation he introduced would also provide us a pathway for the district to join 17 other states in what's called an interstate medical compact, which the shorthand version of that is the ability for people to get licensed in the district, even though they may be in New Mexico or California or Alaska or New York, and to be able to provide telemedicine. So while we might not think of ourselves in D.C. being a vibrant urban center as needing telemedicine, it is a way to close the gap of the healthcare provider shortage by providing telemedicine to our schools and to our senior centers and to the doctor's offices that may not have the specialists. So as opposed to an individual going to, let's say, have an annual physical, doctor says, oh, you have whatever this ailment is, I need you to see a specialist. That specialist may not be in the District of Columbia. That specialist might be in Maryland or Virginia, which is yet another burden, transportation-wise, to someone who does not have a vehicle of their own to try to get over to yet another state, even though our borders are rather porous, but you still have to look at someone who does not have the benefit of a vehicle trying to get there. And if they're not feeling well, that's just a horrible burden for someone to have to travel a longer distance. So,
Janis, we're going to have to take our next break. It's our final break. I really want to come back and understand this telemedicine. That sounds exciting to me, and I'd like to know more about it for me personally and for other people out there. But we'll be right back.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Everything Cooperative is the program, and Ms. Janis Hazel, who's the Communications Director for Mr. Vincent Gray, Ward 7 Council Member, who has some great legislation out that was developed by the people, for the people. And we were talking about telemedicine when we took break. What is that, and how would that work?
Well, this legislation would help to bridge the gap in access for specialists and physicians that are not currently licensed in the District of Columbia. So there's 2 pieces of legislation that I mentioned, the Healthcare Revolving Fund Act, which helps physicians to actually start a practice or open another office on our side of town on the East End, and then the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact Approval Act, which helps to get physicians that don't currently have a license to practice in the District of Columbia to get a license and to be able to provide services via telemedicine, telehealth, televised health, if you will, bringing the specialists closer to the residents that need it. So there's a shortage, as I said, of access in Ward 7 and 8, and the legislation will help supplement those numbers by making it easier for physicians in other jurisdictions, whether it's Maryland, Virginia, and as I said, New York, New Mexico, wherever they are, to practice in the district. Members of the compact would agree to standardize the out-of-state licensure process so that physicians aren't required to redundantly submit the same information to every state board in which they choose to practice. So with such a large portion of our city lacking access to primary and specialty care physicians, it's critical for our city to use every tool at our disposal to bridge these access gaps. And that's what that piece of legislation helps to do. It's a tool. And it all feeds into the council members' push for a comprehensive healthcare system to extend to how we provide care, even to our youngest residents. And that's yet another piece of legislation that he introduced, his Infants and Toddlers Developmental Health Services Act. So it's just a number of things that grew out of that Ward 7 Action Summit that address improving the quality of life for all Ward 7 residents and, by extension, Ward 8 or East End residents. Going back to the hospital, if you look at the numbers, we drilled down the statistics, and right now, of the Ward 7 and 8 residents that use a hospital, only 15% go to the United Medical Center, which is closest to us. As an illustration, 30% of Providence hospitals' 2016 patient population came from zip code 2019, that's Ward 5, 2020, that's Ward 7, and 2032, which is Ward 7 and 8. So the statistics are speaking for themselves. People are voting with their feet, and they're going to other facilities, not here on the East End. So it's really incumbent upon us to change the perception that the only way to receive quality care is to travel outside of your community.
Well, it was interesting when Dr. Frederick from Howard, president of Howard University, who's also who testified at the hearing of how many people from Ward 7 and 8 come to Howard.
Yes.
And it was just and he was for this legislation, which was very nice to hear him speak about Howard University's medical center and how Howard could work with whomever else, whatever hospitals out there to provide care. My niece is she just got her LPN, and she's going for her RN. And it's always interesting to me, even for nurses, how from one state to another, if she grew up most of her life in New Jersey. So she was thinking about going back there, and she said, but once I get licensed here, I've got to do all of this licensing again in New Jersey, and it happened the same way. If somebody got licensed in Jersey, they'd have to do all of the same work to come back here. And I just thought that was a waste of effort and energy and money. So I like this idea of this compact from 17 states. That seems like if you're licensed and you get the education, you should be able to practice in the U.S.
Well, and that is definitely what this legislation seeks to address, is to standardize the out-of-state licensure process so that physicians aren't required to, as I said earlier, redundantly submit the same information to every state board, wait for whatever period of time to get licensed. If you're, as you said, if you attended a accredited school, you went through the accredited training, then you should be able to get a license that will take you throughout the United States.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, I am totally impressed with what you all are doing in Mr. Gray's office, what he's doing with health care. And it's so interesting how education is important in all of this, and that's his first goal. And the fifth principle of cooperation is education, training, and information, that education is critical, and it has been since the beginning of co-ops. In 1844 is when these principles were first written down, and co-ops have gone back a lot longer than that. But it's education is a critical piece of it. And there's a black lady, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nimhart, who has worked at Howard. She's at John Jay in New York right now. But she wrote a book called Collective Carriage. And at the center of co-ops, it's amazing, Janis. I would like to get you a copy of this book. I gave Dr. Frederick my only copy. I'd like to get you a copy of his book because she chronicles the cooperative movement it's mainly from the civil rights. What I've come to learn, if there was not cooperatives, then there would not have been a civil rights movement, or not a civil rights movement the way we understood it. Because in the cooperative world, people were taught about the civil engagement. Rosa Parks went to classes before she sat down on the bus, okay? And what's her rights? It was all out of the cooperative movement that this training took place. And what Dr. Nimhart said was any time that there were like study bees or education bees, and people would come together to learn. And this is what I like about the first goal here in this package is education. But for me, it was all the way through from, like you said, pre-K, all the way through adult education of getting people the education they need to get jobs and make informed decisions about health and everything else. So I really like it. What's your take on this education piece?
Well, after the summit back in December, the council member knew that it was clear that one of his goals of his legislative agenda had to be to improve education outcomes, to close the achievement gap of our youth. And so through the legislation he's introduced and will be introducing, the Infant and Toddler Developmental Health Services Act, which is to lay the foundation for a healthcare system for infants and toddlers on the East End, will also address the deficit we have in regards to the availability of high-quality child care slots. That legislation would expand the number of infant and toddler education facilities by 4 in Wards 7 and 8 initially. It would increase reimbursements to child care facilities, and it would create a badly needed compensation scale for teachers of infants and toddlers, which is desperately needed since new educational criteria has been approved for early childhood educators. And another element that we don't talk about a lot is establishing lactation programs that's breastfeeding children. Since there is much research supporting the intellectual value of breastfeeding, and a number of our mothers are not trained in lactation, therefore they're not doing it, and that has proven to be harmful to children in their immune systems and their development, their intellectual development as well. So that's also a part of the legislation in increasing the high-quality infant and toddler lactation training and supports, recognizing that children can and do fall behind well before their third birthday. So it's just each piece of legislation he's introducing fits into another. It's like a puzzle that he's trying to solve through education, through economic development. He also put together the Ward 7 Economic Development Advisory Council, which consists
Before you move on, just real quickly, I was surprised to find out, and you may too, that in Greenbelt and on Capitol Hill, there are co-op child care facilities that are owned by parents. So the parents own the facility and they learn how to run it. And it also brings the price down because they volunteer in it. So just another example of how co-ops work and in areas I never would have even thought about. So keep on. Go ahead and talk about we only have another minute. Right. So I need you to think about what message you want to give people in the next minute and a half.
The message that I think is overriding that we need to know about is advocacy. The council member can introduce legislation, but he alone cannot always get the other 12 members of the council to buy into what he's trying to accomplish for his constituents. So residents like yourself, like myself, like anyone should come down and advocate on behalf of whatever is of concern to them, meaning come down, testify, and don't think of that in terms of a judicial sense in the court system. Think of it in terms of providing information to the council members and to the mayor, for that matter, on what you want out of your tax dollars. Come and testify, be a witness, writing your testimony. Our office and other council member offices, as well as organizations that embrace your view, can assist you. But it's not that difficult. We like to have written testimony, but oftentimes people come down and testify just based on their concerns and even their non-statistical information. They just come down and say, this is what I want, this is what I want you to provide, meaning the council and tax dollars, and this is when I want it. It's coming and letting us know.
Thank you, Janis. Thank you very much. I really appreciate what you and Mr. Gray are doing. And I thank you for taking out the time here. Everybody else,
thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next Thursday. Please work cooperatively.
Washington, D.C.'s News Talk, 1450 AM WOS and 95.9